Sometimes a man's worst nightmare begins the moment he looks in the mirror. For Eli Cutter, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning when half his face had swollen beyond recognition. The cowboy had survived 43 years in the unforgiving desert, but nothing could have prepared him for what was moving beneath his skin. Doc Harrison had seen everything in his 30 years of practice, and his hands shook as he examined the writhing mass under Eli's eye. Strange parasites crawled beneath the surface, unlike anything in his medical books. Soon other people in town started showing the same symptoms. Some began disappearing without a trace. Eli realized this nightmare connected to a cattle drive from 10 years back, a sealed cave, and a bite he'd forgotten about. What had he awakened from the desert floor? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bathroom mirror in Eli Cutter's ranch house had witnessed 43 years of weathered mornings, but nothing like this. The reflection staring back at him belonged in a nightmare, not in the modest home he built with his own hands on the edge of Copper Ridge. The swelling had appeared overnight, transforming the left side of his face into something grotesque and alien. Beneath the stretched skin, something moved with a life of its own. Eli pressed his fingertips against the distorted flesh, feeling the writhing beneath. The sensation made his stomach lurch. In all his years working cattle, breaking horses, and surviving the harsh realities of desert life, he'd never experienced anything that made him feel so fundamentally wrong in his own skin. The worn leather journal on his bedside table caught his eye, the same one he'd carried during that cattle drive a decade ago. He hadn't looked at those pages in years, but now fragments of memories stirred like dust devils on the horizon. A sealed cave, the taste of fear, Tommy's worried voice echoing off stone walls. Why was he thinking about that now? Copper Ridge existed where the desert met civilization, a town of maybe 300 souls who understood that survival meant looking out for each other. Eli had been part of that fabric for most of his adult life, respected for his steady judgment and willingness to help neighbors through hard times. His ranch sat on good water, and he built a modest but successful operation, breeding quarter horses for working ranches throughout the territory. The drive into town felt different with his face, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The familiar landscape red rock formations jutting from scrubland, the distant mountains purple in morning light, usually filled him with quiet contentment. Today, it felt like a painted backdrop hiding something sinister. Doc Harrison's clinic occupied a converted general store on Main Street, its windows catching the early sun. Samuel Harrison had served Copper Ridge for 30 years, delivering 3 generations of babies and patching up everything from knife wounds to broken hearts. His steady hands and gentle bedside manner had earned him the kind of respect that money couldn't buy. The waiting room was empty when Eli entered, keeping his hat low and collar high. Mary, Doc's nurse and receptionist, looked up from her paperwork with professional concern. "Morning, Eli. Doc's in his office. You can go right back." The examination room smelled of antiseptic and old wood. Doc Harrison looked up from washing his hands, his gray beard neatly trimmed, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. At 62, he moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that hasty decisions could cost lives. "What brings you in so early, Eli?" Without a word, Eli removed his hat. Doc's expression shifted from casual concern to professional alarm in the space of a heartbeat. His hands, steady through thousands of examinations, trembled slightly as he guided Eli to the examination table. "When did this start?" "Woke up like this. Wasn't there last night?" Doc's fingers probed the swollen tissue with clinical gentleness, but Eli could see the worry deepening in his eyes. The flesh felt hot and strange, pulsing with an irregular rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat. When Doc pulled out his penlight, and leaned close. Both men saw something that made them freeze. Movement. Definite, purposeful movement beneath the skin. Jesus and Mary, Doc whispered, pulling back. Eli, I need to take a closer look at this. Can you lie down? The next hour passed in a haze of medical instruments, hushed consultations with textbooks, and increasingly concerned glances. Doc had seen rattlesnake bites, spider envenomations, and every kind of infection the desert could produce. This was none of those things. I'm going to need to extract a sample, Doc finally said, his voice carefully controlled. There's something under there that doesn't belong in any medical text I've ever read. The procedure was quick but unsettling. When Doc's scalpel made a small incision, something pale and segmented wriggled out into the specimen jar. Both men stared at the creature, if that's what it was, as it moved with obvious intelligence against the glass. Doc, Eli said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think hard before you answer. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Anything at all? Harrison shook his head slowly. In 30 years of practice, I've never encountered a parasite like this. The morphology is completely unfamiliar. Look at the way it responds to light. Indeed, when Doc moved the jar near the window, the creature seemed to writhe more vigorously, as if seeking the source of illumination. There's something else, Eli said. I've been having dreams. Strange dreams about a cave, about something we found during a cattle drive 10 years back. Tommy Martinez was with me. Doc set down the specimen jar carefully. Tommy Martinez was Sheriff Martinez's younger brother, a quiet man who worked various ranches around the county. Good with horses, reliable in a crisis, but he'd been acting strange lately. Come to think of it, Doc couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Tommy in town. Eli, I want you to stay close to home for a few days while I research this. Don't work alone, and if anyone else in your household starts showing symptoms, I live alone. Doc, for the past 5 years since Sarah passed. The mention of Eli's late wife brought a moment of respectful silence. Sarah Cutter had been the town's unofficial welcome committee, the woman who brought casseroles to new families and organized fundraisers for anyone facing hard times. Her death from cancer had hit Eli hard, but he carried on with the quiet dignity that defined him. All right then, but I want you to check in with me daily. And Eli, don't mention this to anyone else just yet. Let me figure out what we're dealing with first. The drive home took Eli past the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Ruth Castellanos was already preparing for the day's customers. Ruth had run the place for 15 years, ever since her husband died in a ranching accident. She served good food, kept the peace with a combination of stern looks and sharp wit, and somehow managed to know everyone's business without being intrusive about it. Their eyes met through the window as Eli drove past. Ruth's expression shifted, from her usual friendly wave to concern as she noticed his hat pulled low and the careful way he held his head. She'd been watching out for him since Sarah's death, not in a romantic sense, but with the kind of protective instinct that bound the community together. Back at the ranch, Eli sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The familiar sounds of horses moving in the pasture, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods by the creek, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, all of it felt different now, as if he were experiencing it through someone else's senses. He opened the leather journal to pages he hadn't read in a decade. His younger self's handwriting documented a routine cattle drive that had taken an unexpected turn. Day 3. Lost the main trail around noon. Tommy thinks he knows a shortcut through the rock country. Told him we should turn back, but he insists. Day 4. Found something we shouldn't have. Cave sealed with stones. Tommy says we should open it, see if there's water inside. I don't like it, but the cattle need water soon. The entries became increasingly sparse after that. Day 5, simply read. Heading home. Don't want to write about yesterday. The final entry was in different ink. Added later. Tommy's acting strange. Says he doesn't remember much about the cave. Maybe that's for the best. Eli closed the journal, frustrated by his past self's reluctance to record details. What had they found in that cave? Why had he been so reluctant to write about it? And why was he remembering it now, just as this thing started growing under his skin? Outside, his horses grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. Prince, his prize stallion, lifted his head and nickered softly in Eli's direction. The animal's liquid brown eyes held the same trust and affection they always had, but Eli wondered if that would change. Animals had a way of sensing when something was wrong with people, sometimes before the people themselves knew it. The sound of a truck on his gravel drive broke the afternoon quiet. Through the window, he saw Sheriff Martinez's patrol vehicle kicking up dust as it approached. Roberto Martinez had been law enforcement in Copper Ridge for 8 years, a steady man who understood that keeping the peace in a small town required more diplomacy than force. He was also Tommy's older brother. Eli met him on the front porch, hat still pulled low. "Afternoon, Sheriff. What brings you out this way?" "Looking for Tommy, actually. He missed a job at the Hendricks place yesterday. Didn't show up today either. That's not like him." "You seen him around?" The question hit Eli like a physical blow. Tommy Martinez, reliable Tommy who never missed work, had disappeared just as Eli's symptoms appeared. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore. "Can't say I have." "When did you last see him?" Sheriff Martinez removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. 3 days ago. He seemed agitated about something. Kept talking about old times, old mistakes. Said he needed to make something right, but wouldn't tell me what. 3 days. Right around the time Eli's dreams about the cave had intensified. "Sheriff, I need to ask you something confidential. Has anyone else in town reported any unusual symptoms lately? Sickness, strange dreams, anything out of the ordinary?" The lawman's expression sharpened. "Why do you ask?" Eli made a decision that would change everything. He lifted his hat, revealing the swollen mass that had once been half his face. "Sheriff." Martinez took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before stopping. "Sweet Mother of God, Eli, what happened to you?" "I don't know, but I think it might be connected to Tommy's disappearance. We need to find him, Roberto, and we need to find him soon." The two men stood in the lengthening shadows of the porch, both understanding that whatever was happening in Copper Ridge was just beginning. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound carried an edge of hunger that seemed to echo from somewhere much deeper than the desert floor. The medical specimen jar sat on Doc Harrison's desk like an accusation, its pale occupant moving with unsettling purpose against the glass. For 3 days, Doc had pored over every parasitology text in his collection, contacted colleagues at the state medical school, and even reached out to specialists at the Centers for Disease Control. None of them had seen anything remotely similar. The creature, he'd stopped thinking of it as a simple parasite, responded to stimuli in ways that suggested genuine intelligence. When exposed to direct sunlight, it became agitated, pressing against the side of the jar nearest the light source. In darkness, it settled into what appeared to be a dormant state, though it never stopped the subtle undulating movement that made Doc's skin crawl. "Doc, you need to see this." Mary's voice from the waiting room carried an urgency that made him look up from his research. Through the frosted glass of his office door, he could see the silhouette of someone hunched in obvious distress. Martha. Hendricks sat in the waiting room chair, her weathered hands pressed against the left side of her face. At 73, Martha had the kind of toughness that came from raising 6 children and outliving 2 husbands on a hardscrabble ranch. She wasn't the type to seek medical attention unless something was seriously wrong. "Martha, what brings?" "You in today?" When she lowered her hands, Doc felt his blood turn to ice water. The same grotesque swelling that had afflicted Eli now distorted Martha's features, transforming her familiar grandmother's face into something from a fever dream. Beneath the stretched skin, movement writhed with the same purposeful intelligence he'd observed in the specimen jar. "Started yesterday evening," she said, her voice thick with fear and embarrassment. "Thought maybe I'd been bit by something, but it just keeps getting worse. And Doc, there's something else. I've been having the strangest dreams." "Dreams about what, Martha?" "A cave, dark and warm with strange marks on the walls. And Tommy Martinez is there, but he's different somehow. Younger maybe, or scared. There's something in the cave with us. Something that's been waiting." Doc's hands remained steady as he examined Martha, but his mind raced. 2 cases of the same impossible condition, both accompanied by dreams of the same cave. This was no longer a medical mystery. It was something that defied everything he understood about disease, transmission, and parasitology. "Martha, I need to ask you something very important. Have you been in contact with Eli Cutter recently?" "Eli? Not for weeks." "Why would?" She stopped, her eyes widening with understanding. "He has it too, doesn't he? The same thing that's wrong with me." Doc nodded grimly. "I need you to stay calm while I run some tests. And Martha? Have you told anyone else about your dreams?" Before she could answer, the clinic door burst open. Sheriff Martinez entered with the kind of controlled urgency that spoke of bad news. His usually neat uniform was dusty, and his expression carried the weight of sleepless nights. "Doc, we've got a problem." "Make that several problems." "Sheriff, I'm with a patient right now. This can't wait." Roberto glanced at Martha, then back to Doc. "We found Tommy's truck this morning, abandoned out by Devil's Canyon. No sign of him, but there was blood on the seat. And Doc, there were 2 other vehicles there. Pete Rawlings' pickup and the Morrison family's sedan." Martha gasped, pressing her swollen face. "Pete and the Morrisons? But they're missing too?" "Missing?" Doc felt the situation spiraling beyond his ability to process. "Roberto, what exactly are you telling me?" The sheriff pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages with shaking fingers. "In the past 4 days, I've gotten reports of 7 people missing from their homes. No signs of struggle, no notes, nothing stolen. It's like they just walked away in the middle of their lives." 7 people, Doc repeated slowly. "Roberto, I think we need to have a very serious conversation, privately." He left Martha in the examination room with strict instructions not to leave the building, then led the sheriff into his office. The specimen jar seemed to pulse with increased activity, as if sensing the tension in the room. "What the hell is that thing?" Roberto asked, staring at the writhing creature. "I extracted it from Eli Cutter's face 3 days ago, and now Martha Hendricks has the same condition." Doc sat heavily in his chair. "Roberto, I think you're missing. People aren't actually missing. I think they're sick. Sick with whatever this is." The sheriff studied the specimen with the expression of a man watching his orderly world collapse. "You're saying this thing caused 7 people to abandon their homes and disappear into the desert?" "I'm saying I don't know what this thing is. Capable of But Martha mentioned dreams about a cave. The same dreams Eli's been having. Dreams about your brother Tommy." Roberto's face went pale. "Tommy's been missing for 4 days. That's when this all started, isn't it?" "I believe so." "And there's something else. This creature responds to sunlight in unusual ways. It becomes more active, almost agitated. I've been tracking its behavior patterns, and there's a clear correlation with lunar cycles." "Lunar cycles?" "The full moon was 3 nights ago, Roberto. That's when Eli's symptoms first appeared. And if I'm right, tonight's moon phase might trigger something we're not prepared for." As if summoned by their conversation, Mary's voice called from the waiting room. "Doc, You need to come quickly. Something's wrong with Martha." They rushed into the waiting room to find Martha standing perfectly still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening to something only she could hear. Her swollen face had taken on a waxy quality, and her eyes held no recognition of where she was or who was with her. "Martha?" Doc approached cautiously. "Can you hear me?" She turned toward him with mechanical precision, and when she spoke, her voice carried an odd harmonic quality, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "The calling has begun. We must return to the source. The time of sleeping is ended." Roberto reached for his radio. "I'm calling for backup." "No," Doc said sharply. "Not yet. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we involve more people." Martha began walking toward the door with the same mechanical gait, ignoring their attempts to communicate with her. She moved with purpose, as if following an invisible path that only she could see. "She's heading toward the desert," Roberto observed. "Same direction as Devil's Canyon." Doc made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Let her go. Are you insane? Think about it, Roberto. 7 people have disappeared in that direction. If we follow Martha, she might lead us to them. And to Tommy. They watched through the clinic window as Martha Hendricks walked into the desert with the inexorable purpose of a sleepwalker. Her figure grew smaller against the vast landscape, heading toward the red rock country where the canyon systems hid caves and secrets older than human memory. "Doc," Roberto said quietly, "what if they're not missing? What if they're being collected?" The specimen jar on Doc's desk seemed to pulse with renewed vigor, its occupant pressing against the glass with increasing desperation. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and the approaching night promised answers that neither man was prepared to face. In the distance, Martha's figure disappeared into the maze of stone and shadow that had swallowed 7 other souls. The desert wind carried no sound of her passing, only the whisper of sand against rock and the promise of revelations to come. Doc. Harrison closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd become a doctor in the first place. It had something to do with helping people, with healing. But as he watched the thing in the jar writhe against its glass prison, he wondered if healing was even possible when the disease itself might be older than civilization and hungry for more than just human flesh. Eli's hands shook as he pulled boxes down from the highest shelf in his bedroom closet. 10 years of accumulated dust covered everything, but he knew what he was looking for, the remnants of that cattle drive that had somehow become the center of his nightmare. The tattered map fragment lay folded between old photographs and cattle records, its edges worn from handling and weather. The original route was marked in blue ink, but someone had drawn a red line deviating from the planned path. Eli's younger self had marked the deviation with a single word: mistake. Now, sitting in his kitchen with the map spread before him, fragments of memory came flooding back. Tommy had been insistent about the shortcut, claiming he knew the country better than the mapped routes. There had been something desperate about his urgency, something that hadn't made sense at the time. Sound of boots on his front porch interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he saw a familiar figure, Tommy's replacement at the Hendricks Ranch, a young cowboy named Jake, who'd been working the area for about 6 months. "Mr. Cutter? I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard you were looking into Tommy's disappearance." Eli kept his hat low as he opened the door. "What makes you think that?" "Because I was part of that drive too, sir. 10 years ago. I was just a kid then, working for my uncle's outfit, but I remember that cave." The words hit Eli like lightning. "You were there?" Jake nodded, his young face serious beyond his years. "Tommy made me swear never to tell anyone what happened. Said it would just cause trouble. But with him missing and talk around town about strange sickness." "Come in," Eli said quickly, glancing around to make sure no one else was on the road. "Tell me everything you remember." Inside, Jake studied the map with recognition. That's the route, all right. We were supposed to follow Copper Creek south to the main trail, but Tommy convinced everyone to cut through the rock country. Sighed. He'd been through there before. Had he? I don't think so, Mr. Cutter. He seemed as surprised as anyone when we found that sealed cave. But once he saw it, Jake paused, his expression troubled. It was like something came over him. He became obsessed with opening it. Eli felt the swelling in his face pulse with increased intensity. What did we find inside? You really don't. Remember? Pieces. Fragments. It's like someone took an eraser to parts of my memory. Jake sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. The cave was warm, much warmer than it should have been. And there were markings on the walls, symbols that looked older than anything I'd ever seen. But that's not what worried me most. What did? The eggs, Mr. Cutter. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in perfect patterns along the chamber walls. Some were empty, like whatever had been inside had already hatched. But others, he shuddered. Others were moving. The memory came, rushing back with such force that Eli nearly fell from his chair. The chamber, the warmth, the sense of something ancient and patient waiting in the darkness. And yes, the eggs. How could he have forgotten something so alien and terrifying? Tommy touched one of them, Jake continued. Said he wanted to see what was inside. That's when something bit him. Small thing, pale and segmented. He brushed it off, said it was nothing, but I could see the puncture marks on his hand. And me? Was I bitten too? You tried to help him, pulled him away from the wall. That's when several more of those things came out of the eggs. One got you on the neck before we could get out of there. Eli's hand moved instinctively to his neck, where he could now feel a small, faded scar he'd never paid attention to before. Why didn't we report it? Why didn't we get medical attention? Tommy convinced us it was nothing. Said the bites were tiny, probably not dangerous. And at the time, neither of you seemed affected. No swelling, no fever, nothing. We sealed the cave back up and finished the drive like nothing had happened. But something did happen, Eli said quietly. Just not right away. Jake nodded. I think those things went dormant inside you and Tommy, waiting for something. Waiting for what? I don't know, but I've been having dreams lately. Dreams about that cave, about things moving under the desert. And Mr. Cutter? Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. I've been feeling strange, like something's waking up inside me. Eli studied the young man's face carefully. In the afternoon light filtering through the kitchen window, he could see a slight asymmetry around Jake's left eye, a subtle swelling that would be easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. Jake, I need you to see Doc Harrison, today. I was afraid you'd say that. Jake stood up, then hesitated. Mr. Cutter, there's something else. About the people who've gone missing? They're not the only ones who were on that drive. What do you mean? I've been checking around quietly. Pete Rawlings was there. He was working for the Morrison outfit. And Ben Morrison, the father who's missing with his family. He was the trail boss. There were 12 of us on that drive, Mr. Cutter. And so far, 5 have disappeared. The mathematics of horror settled over Eli like a shroud. If Jake was right, then everyone who had been exposed to the cave was now affected. The disappearances weren't random. They were systematic. Jake, who else was on that drive? I need names. The young cowboy pulled out a worn piece of paper. I wrote them down years ago. Thought I might need to remember someday. Besides you. Me, Tommy, Pete, and the Morrison family. There's Sarah Hendricks. That's Martha's daughter-in-law who moved to Phoenix. Carlos Santos, who works the Jenkins Ranch now. And old Frank Wheeler. Eli knew Frank Wheeler, a retired rancher who lived alone in a cabin 20 miles outside town. If the pattern held, Frank might already be affected, possibly heading toward whatever was calling the infected into the desert. "We need to warn them," Eli said. "All of them." "Mr. Cutter, what if warning them makes it worse? What if talking about it somehow triggers the process?" It was a terrifying possibility, but Eli couldn't bear the thought of more people disappearing without warning. "Jake, I want you to go see Doc Harrison right now. Tell him everything you've told me. And ask him about the lunar cycles. I think there's a connection." After Jake left, Eli sat alone with the map and his memories. The red line that marked their deviation from the planned route seemed to pulse with malevolent significance. They had stumbled into something that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than human civilization, something patient enough to wait 10 years before beginning its harvest. Outside, his horses moved restlessly in the pasture, and Prince approached the fence nearest the house. The stallion's liquid eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and for a moment, Eli wondered if the infection could spread to animals as well. The thought made him shudder. If this thing could affect livestock, the implications for the entire region were catastrophic. But as he looked at Prince's concerned but healthy expression, he realized the horses were trying to warn him about something else entirely. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the approach of vehicles. Multiple vehicles moving fast toward his ranch. Eli grabbed his rifle from the gun cabinet, not sure what he might be facing, but certain that his quiet investigation was about to become much more complicated. The dust cloud resolved into 3 vehicles. Sheriff Martinez's patrol car, followed by 2 unmarked SUVs with government plates. Eli watched from his kitchen window as men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, their movements precise and coordinated in a way that spoke of federal training. Sheriff Martinez approached the house while the federal agents hung back, but Eli could see the tension in Roberto's shoulders. This wasn't a friendly visit. "Eli, we need to talk. These gentlemen are from the CDC, here to investigate reports of unusual illness in the area." The lead agent stepped forward, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Cutter, I'm Agent Williams with the Centers for Disease Control. We understand you've been in contact with Dr. Harrison regarding a medical condition." Eli kept his rifle in plain sight, but not directly threatening. "Might be. Depends on what your interest is." "We're here to help, Mr. Cutter. There have been reports of people becoming ill and subsequently disappearing. We believe there may be an environmental hazard in the area." "Environmental hazard?" Eli repeated slowly. "That's an interesting way to put it." Agent Williams' expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Sir, have you been experiencing any symptoms yourself? Unusual swelling, changes in behavior, vivid dreams?" The specificity of the question sent chills down Eli's spine. How could they know about the dreams unless they'd encountered this before? "I think I'd like to speak with my lawyer before answering any more questions." "Mr. Cutter, this isn't a criminal investigation. We're simply trying to contain what appears to be a biological hazard. The sooner we understand the scope of the problem, the sooner we can provide medical assistance." Sheriff Martinez stepped closer to the porch. "Eli, they found Pete Rawlings." "Found him? Where?" 20 miles out in the desert, near an old mining claim. "He was alive, but..." Roberto's voice caught. "He wasn't himself anymore. They had to sedate him to get him into medical transport." Agent Williams consulted a tablet computer. "Mr. Rawlings exhibited advanced symptoms of the condition we're investigating. He was found in a catatonic state, unresponsive to external stimuli, but showing signs of directed behavior toward a specific geographic location." "What kind of directed behavior?" "He had walked approximately 15 miles through desert terrain, without water or supplies, following a precise bearing toward Devil's Canyon. When found, he was attempting to move stones from what appeared to be a sealed cave entrance." Eli felt the blood drain from his face. Pete had reached the cave, or something very much like it. The infection was driving the victims back to the source. Agent Williams, how long have you been tracking this condition? The federal agent exchanged a glance with his partner. Mr. Cutter, I think it would be better if we continued this conversation in a more controlled environment. We have medical facilities. No. Eli's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent decades making life and death decisions. If you want my cooperation, you'll answer my questions first. How long have you known about this? Agent Williams was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. We've been monitoring anomalous biological activity in this region for several years. There have been isolated incidents, usually involving individuals who report exposure to underground cave systems. Isolated incidents. How many people have died? Mr. Cutter, how many? Sheriff Martinez answered instead. Eli, they told me about cases in Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona going back 5 years. Small numbers each time, but always the same pattern. Exposure to sealed caves, delayed onset of symptoms, and eventual disappearance. And what happened to those people? Agent Williams' expression remained neutral, but his answer chilled Eli to the bone. In most cases, the affected individuals were found in advanced stages of biological integration with the parasitic organism. Medical intervention was no longer possible. Integration, Eli repeated. You mean they died? No, Mr. Cutter. That's the problem. They didn't die. They changed. Before Eli could process the implications of that statement, his attention was drawn to movement near the barn. Jake's truck was approaching, but something was wrong with the way he was driving. The vehicle moved too slowly, following an unnaturally straight line across the rough ground. Roberto, something's wrong with Jake. They watched as the truck came to a stop near the barn. Jake climbed out with the same mechanical precision they'd observed in Martha Hendricks. His face showed the telltale swelling, but more advanced than Eli had seen just hours earlier. The calling grows stronger, Jake said in the same harmonic voice Martha had used. The time of return approaches. Agent Williams spoke into his radio in code phrases that Eli couldn't decipher, but the message was clear. They were calling for backup and containment equipment. Jake, Eli called, stepping off his porch despite the federal agent's protests. Can you hear me? It's Eli. The young cowboy turned toward him with mechanical precision. Eli Cutter, you carry the gift within you. Why do you resist the calling? What calling, Jake? What are you hearing? The voice of the deep places. The song of the first mothers. They have been waiting so long for us to return home. Agent Williams appeared at Eli's shoulder. Mr. Cutter, I strongly advise you to step back. The affected individuals can become aggressive if they perceive threats to their migration pattern. Migration. Pattern? They're being drawn to specific locations, always underground cave systems. We believe the organisms are attempting to return to their original nesting sites. Jake began walking toward the desert with the same purposeful gait Martha had displayed. Agent Williams made no move to stop him, and when Sheriff Martinez started forward, the federal agent restrained him. Let him go? Containment at this stage often results in violent behavior. It's better to track them and intervene at the destination. Eli watched Jake disappear into the scrubland, following the same invisible path that had claimed so many others. Agent Williams, what aren't you telling me? You've been tracking this for years. You have protocols in place. You know exactly what we're dealing with. This isn't some new biological hazard. You've encountered it before. The federal agent's composure cracked slightly. Mr. Cutter, there are aspects of this situation that involve national security. What I can tell you is that the organism appears to be ancient, predating known parasitic species by potentially millions of years. Ancient how? Carbon dating of recovered specimens suggests origins in the Precambrian era. The organisms appear to enter extended dormancy periods in sealed underground environments, activating only when disturbed. Sheriff Martinez had been listening with growing alarm. You're talking about something that's been in the ground since before dinosaurs? The geological evidence suggests these cave systems have been sealed and unsealed multiple times throughout history. We believe there may have been previous exposure events, possibly accounting for certain unexplained disappearances in the archaeological record. Eli felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The cattle drive wasn't the first time that cave was opened, was it? Agent Williams consulted his tablet again. Ground-penetrating radar suggests the cave system you and your companions accessed 10 years ago was previously disturbed in 1952. Prior to that, there's evidence of Native American activity in the area going back several centuries. 1952, Roberto said quietly. That's when they were doing atomic testing in Nevada. My grandfather used to talk about strange lights in the desert around that time. The Atomic Energy Commission conducted geological surveys throughout this region as part of their testing program. It's possible they encountered the organism during excavation activities. And what happened to the people who were exposed then? Agent Williams was quiet for a long moment. The records from that period are classified, but there were reports of missing survey teams and unexplained equipment failures. A chill ran down Eli's spine as he realized the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back decades, possibly centuries. How many people had been claimed by this ancient parasite over the years? Agent Williams, you said the affected individuals undergo biological integration. What does that actually mean? The organism appears to form a symbiotic relationship with human hosts. Initially, it causes the physical symptoms you observed: swelling, behavioral changes, auditory hallucinations. But in advanced stages, the integration becomes more complete. Complete how? The host's consciousness appears to merge with a collective intelligence. Individual personality and memories are retained, but subordinated to the organism's directive to return to the nesting site. And then what happens? Agent Williams exchanged another glance with his partner. Mr. Cutter, I think it would be better if we showed you. We have footage from previous incidents. No, Eli said firmly. I want answers now. What happens to people? When they reach these caves, they become part of the breeding cycle. The organism uses human hosts to expand its population and establish new colonies. The process isn't immediately fatal, but the human consciousness gradually diminishes until only the collective remains. The horror of it settled over Eli like a lead blanket. Jake, Martha, Pete, Tommy, all of them were walking toward a fate worse than death. Their humanity slowly being erased by an ancient intelligence that viewed them as nothing more than incubators. How long do they have? He asked quietly. Based on previous cases, complete integration typically occurs within 72 hours of the migration behavior beginning. After that, intervention becomes impossible. Eli looked out at the desert where Jake had disappeared, then at the federal agents who had been studying this nightmare for years. A terrible certainty was forming in his mind. You're not here to save them, are you? You're here to study the process. Agent Williams' silence was answer enough. The Silver Dollar Saloon had never felt so much like a fortress. Ruth Castellanos moved behind the bar with practiced efficiency, but her eyes kept drifting to the corner table where a folded piece of paper lay like an accusation she'd found it that morning when she'd gone to check on her granddaughter Sophia, slipped under the door of their small apartment above the saloon. The handwriting was Tommy Martinez's, shaky and desperate but undeniably his. She'd read it 3 times, each reading making her feel sicker than the last. Now, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, she kept glancing at the paper, wondering if she should burn it or take it to Sheriff Martinez. The front door chimed as Doc Harrison entered, his medical bag in one hand and a haunted expression on his weathered face. Ruth had known Sam Harrison for 20 years, had patched him up after bar fights and brought him soup when he was sick. She'd never seen him look so defeated. "Afternoon, Ruth. I could use something strong." She poured him a whiskey, without asking what kind. "You look like hell, Sam. What's happening out there?" Doc drained the glass in one swallow, then set it down with shaking hands. "Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Have you noticed any changes in Sophia lately? Any unusual behavior? Complaints of strange dreams?" Ruth felt her blood turn to ice. "Why would you ask that?" "Because this thing that's affecting people, it's not random. There's a pattern, and I'm afraid Sophia might be at risk." Ruth's hands moved protectively to the letter in her apron pocket. "Sam, I need to show you something. But first, you need to promise me that whatever is in this letter, we handle it carefully. No federal agents, no government intervention until we understand what we're dealing with." She handed him Tommy's letter, watching his expression change from confusion to alarm to horror as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her with eyes that held too much terrible knowledge. "Ruth, this changes everything. Where did you find this?" "Under my door this morning." "Sam, tell me Tommy's still alive. Tell me there's hope." Doc Harrison's confession letter was written in the desperate scrawl of a man racing against time and his own failing consciousness. The words seemed to burn themselves into Ruth's memory as Doc read them aloud in the empty saloon. "Ruth, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back from the desert. I'm writing this while I can still think clearly, while the voices in my head are still quiet enough for me to remember who I used to be. 10 years ago, Eli and I did something terrible. We opened something that should have stayed sealed. I've carried the guilt ever since, but I thought it was over. Thought we'd gotten away with our mistake. I was wrong. The things we found in that cave, they were waiting. Patient as stone, hungry as winter. They burrowed into us that day. Eli and me and the others. We didn't know it at the time. Didn't feel them settling into our bodies like seeds in fertile ground. But they were there, waiting for the right conditions to grow. I started feeling them move about a week ago. Started hearing their whispers in the quiet moments before dawn. They're calling me home, Ruth. Calling all of us who were there that day. And the terrible thing is, part of me wants to go. I can feel my thoughts changing, my memories shifting. Soon I won't remember why I should fight this. Won't remember the people I'm leaving behind. But right now, in this moment of clarity, I need you to know, Sophia is in danger. She wasn't on the cattle drive. She was just a baby then. But she's been exposed to me, spent time around me when the infection was beginning to activate. I can see the signs starting in her. The way she stares at nothing for long minutes. The way she draws pictures of caves and dark places she's never seen. Don't let them take her. Ruth, don't let the government men in their dark suits convince you that they can help. They've been watching, waiting, studying us like specimens in jars. They don't want to cure this thing. They want to understand it, control it, maybe even use it. There's something else you need to know. The cave we opened it wasn't the only one. The infection is spreading, not just through direct contact, but through some kind of biological signal. The organism is trying to wake up others of its kind, sealed in caves throughout the region. I've seen the maps in my dreams, felt the pull of dozens of different locations where the ancient ones sleep. If they all wake up, if all the sealed places open at once, there won't be anywhere safe. I'm leaving this with you because you're the strongest person I know, and because you love Sophia enough to fight for her. Doc Harrison can help. He understands more about this than he's letting on. And Eli, if he's still himself when you read this, he has the knowledge you'll need. The key is in the original cave, the place where it all started. There's something there besides the nests, something the entities fear. I saw it in a dream that felt more like a memory symbols carved into the deepest chamber. Protective wards left by people who fought this before. Don't mourn for me, Ruth. I made my choice. 10 years ago, when I convinced everyone to open that cave. This is my price to pay. But Sophia, she's innocent. She deserves a chance to grow up free of this ancient hunger. Fight for her, Ruth. Fight for all of them. Tommy. When Doc finished reading, the silence in the saloon felt heavy enough to crush stone. Ruth stared at her reflection in the mirror behind the bar, seeing for the first time the exhaustion and fear that had been building for days. Sam, Sophie has been drawing pictures. Strange pictures of underground places and people with swollen faces. I thought it was just childhood imagination, but after reading this, where is she now? Upstairs, napping. She's been sleeping a lot lately, and when she's awake, she seems distant, like she's listening to something I can't hear. Doc stood up, his medical training taking over despite his emotional turmoil. I need to examine her, Ruth, and we need to do it now. Before, his words were cut off by the sound of small footsteps on the stairs leading down from the apartment. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her 8-year-old face serious beyond her years. She looked directly at Doc Harrison with eyes that seemed far older than they should be. Dr. Sam, you don't need to examine me. I already know what's happening, and I know where we need to go. Ruth's family photograph sat on the bar like a talisman against the darkness that seemed to be swallowing her world. 3 generations smiled back at her from behind the glass. Her late husband Miguel, their daughter Carmen, and little Sophia. At age 5, gap-toothed and grinning in the desert sunshine. It had been taken just 3 years ago, but it felt like a lifetime. Now Sophia stood in the doorway of the saloon, her young face bearing an expression of ancient knowledge that no child should possess. The swelling around her left eye was subtle, but unmistakable, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same harmonic quality they'd heard from the other infected. Abuela Ruth, Dr. Sam, you're scared, but you don't need to be. The mothers aren't angry, they're just trying to come home. Ruth moved protectively toward her granddaughter, but Doc Harrison caught her arm. Ruth, wait, let her talk. We need to understand what she's experiencing. She's 8 years old, Sam. She shouldn't be experiencing any of this. Sophia approached them with the careful, measured steps they'd observed in the other infected. But unlike Martha or Jake, there was still recognition in her eyes. Still some trace of the little girl Ruth had raised for the past 3 years. I can hear them singing, Abuela. They'd been singing for so long, waiting for someone to listen. Uncle Tommy tried to fight the song, but it made him sad. It's easier when you don't fight. Sophia, sweetheart, what are the mothers telling you? The child tilted her head, as if listening to voices only she could hear. They're showing me the deep places, the caves where they used to live before the big burning came from the sky. They had to sleep for so long, but now they're waking up. Doc Harrison knelt to Sophia's eye level, his medical training warring with his growing horror. Sophia, can you show us what they're showing you? Can you draw it? Without a word, Sophia went to the bar and picked up a napkin and a pen. Her small hands moved with surprising confidence, sketching a network of interconnected chambers that stretched deep underground. The detail was impossible for a child her age, showing geological formations and structural elements that suggested genuine knowledge of cave systems. This is the first home, she said, pointing to the largest chamber on her drawing. Uncle Tommy and Mr. Eli found it 10 years ago, but there are others 17 in all. They're connected by the deep water, the rivers that run beneath the desert. Ruth stared at the drawing, recognizing formations that matched the topographical maps Miguel had studied when he was prospecting for water sources. Sophia, how do you know about underground rivers? The mothers remember. They remember when the water ran free and the sky was different, before the burning, before the long sleep. Doc. Harrison studied the child's sketch with growing alarm. Sophia, are all 17 caves waking up? Not all at once. The mothers are careful. They wake up slowly, call their children home gently. But if they're threatened, if the men with loud voices try to hurt them, then they'll all wake up together. The implication hit Ruth like a physical blow. Sam, she's talking about Agent Williams and his team. If they try to intervene, all 17 locations could activate simultaneously, Doc finished. Ruth, we're not talking about a few dozen infected people anymore. If this spreads across multiple cave systems, Sophia looked up from her drawing, with eyes that held infinite sadness. Thousands, Dr. Sam. Maybe tens of thousands. The mothers are very fertile when they need to be. The front door of the saloon burst open, and Eli Cutter stumbled in, his face a grotesque mask of swollen flesh. But unlike the others, he was fighting it, his human consciousness still struggling against the alien influence. Ruth, Sophia, thank God you're both here. We don't have much time. Ruth clutched the family photograph to her chest. Eli, your face. I know how I look, but I'm still me, still fighting it. Ruth, I need you to listen very carefully. The federal agents aren't here to help. They've been studying this for decades, and they have a protocol for containing outbreaks. What kind of protocol? They call it sterilization. If they determine the infection has spread beyond manageable limits, they'll recommend nuclear containment. Doc. Harrison went pale. Nuclear? You mean they'll detonate a low-yield device to seal the cave systems and eliminate all infected individuals. They've done it before, in Nevada in 1952. Passed it off as an atomic test. Ruth felt her world tilting on its axis. They'd kill everyone? Even the children? To them, we're already lost. But Ruth, there's another way. Tommy's letter mentioned protective symbols in the original cave, wards left by people who fought. This before. If we can reach them, Sophia looked up from her drawing with sudden clarity. The first people who lived here, the ones who came before the Spanish, before the Americans. They knew about the mothers. They made a treaty. A treaty? Doc leaned forward, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. What kind of treaty? The mothers would sleep, and the first people would guard their dreams. But the treaty was broken. When the big burning came from the sky, the protective songs were forgotten. Eli stared at the child with a mixture of hope and desperation. Sophia, can you remember the protective songs? Can the mothers teach them to you? They're not songs. You hear with your ears, Mr. Eli. They're patterns carved in stone, symbols that hold power. The mothers fear them, but they also respect them. Ruth made a decision that would change all their lives. She carefully placed the family photograph in her jacket pocket, over her heart, and looked at each of them in turn. Then we go to the cave, all of us together. Doc Harrison shook his head. Ruth, it's too dangerous. If the infection spreads to you, Sam, look at this picture. She showed him the photograph, pointing to Sophia's gap-toothed grin. This is what I'm fighting for. Not just Sophia's life, but her chance to grow up human. If there's even a small possibility that these protective symbols can stop this, then I'm willing to take that risk. Eli nodded, his swollen features twisting into something that might have been a smile. Ruth, there's something else you should know. The federal agents have given us until tomorrow night. After that, they implement the sterilization protocol whether we cooperate or not. Outside, the sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Ruth of the atomic tests her father had witnessed as a young man. She had less than 24 hours to save her granddaughter, her community, and possibly the entire region from an ancient hunger that had already waited millions of years for its chance to feed again. The government research files scattered across Sheriff Martinez's desk looked innocuous enough, manila folders with bureaucratic stamps and classification markings. But as Dr. Sarah Chun spread them out under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department, Roberto felt his understanding of everything that had happened shift like sand beneath his feet. Sheriff Martinez, I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you violates multiple federal security protocols. But given the timeline we're facing, transparency has become more important than containment. Chun was nothing like the other federal agents who had descended on his town. Where they were cold and clinical, she radiated genuine concern and scientific curiosity. Her Asian features were drawn with exhaustion, and her hand shook slightly as she opened the first file. This is the original report from the 1952 Nevada incident. Operation Deep Cave, officially classified as a routine atomic weapons test. Unofficially, it was the first time the United States government encountered what we now call the Precambrian entities. Roberto leaned over the documents, his police training helping him parse the military language and scientific jargon. What he found made his blood run cold. Dr. Chun, this says the Nevada site was discovered during geological surveys for atomic testing. But according to this, the surveys weren't random. They were specifically looking for these cave systems. That's correct. The Atomic Energy Commission had been tracking anomalous biological readings in desert regions since 1949. They'd identified 17 potential sites across Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, where ground-penetrating radar detected unusual underground formations. 17 sites, Roberto said slowly. The same number Sophia mentioned. Chun nodded grimly. The entities exist in connected networks, Sheriff. Each cave system is part of a larger organism that spans hundreds of miles underground. When one site is disturbed, it sends signals to the others. She opened another file, revealing photographs. That made Roberto's stomach churn. Images of test subjects in various stages of biological integration. Their faces distorted by the same parasitic growths now affecting his brother and neighbors. These are human volunteers? Initially, yes. Military personnel who were exposed during the cave excavations. But as the project progressed, Chun's voice caught. The integration process was studied extensively. The subjects were kept alive throughout the entire transformation. Roberto pushed back from the desk. Dr. Chun, are you telling me the government has been deliberately exposing people to this organism for over 70 years? Not deliberately exposing, Sheriff. The way exposures occurred naturally, they were utilized for research purposes. The implication hit him like a physical blow. The cattle drive. Tommy and Eli, and the others. They weren't random victims, were they? Chun opened a third file, revealing surveillance photographs of the original cattle drive team, taken from a distance with telephoto lenses. Roberto recognized his brother's younger face among the cowboys, recognized Eli and the others who were now infected or missing. Your brother was recruited by the Bureau of Land Management to guide cattle drives through specific territories. The routes were designed to take ranching operations near monitored cave sites. Recruited how? Financial incentives, primarily. The BLM offered premium grazing contracts for drives that followed their recommended routes. Tommy was paid additional compensation for filing detailed reports about geological formations and any unusual discoveries. Roberto stared at his brother's photograph, seeing him in an entirely new light. Tommy was working for you. All this time, he was a government asset. Not directly for the CDC, Sheriff. The operation was compartmentalized across multiple agencies. Tommy likely never knew the true purpose of his reporting requirements. But you knew. You knew that route would take them past the cave. Chun's composure cracked slightly. The cave system near Copper Ridge had been identified as dormant based on seismic readings. The biological contamination was expected to be minimal, if present at all. Expected, Roberto repeated, his anger building. You gambled with people's lives. Sheriff, you have to understand the larger context. The Precambrian entities represent both the greatest biological threat and the greatest scientific opportunity in human history. These organisms have survived multiple extinction events, adapting and evolving across geological timescales. The potential applications for medicine, biotechnology, even space exploration. Applications? Roberto's voice rose. Dr. Chun, these things turn people into walking incubators for alien parasites. What possible applications could justify that? Chun opened the final file, revealing research data that made Roberto's scientific illiteracy feel like a blessing. Charts and graphs documented the organism's ability to dramatically extend human lifespan, enhance physical capabilities, and create collective intelligence networks. In controlled circumstances, the integration process can be beneficial to human hosts. Enhanced longevity, increased resistance to disease, expanded cognitive capacity through connection to the collective consciousness. Controlled circumstances? When the integration is voluntary and gradual, when the human consciousness is prepared for the merger rather than overwhelmed by it. Roberto stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Main Street. Outside, Agent Williams and his team were setting up what looked like a military command post, complete with satellite communications, equipment, and biological containment units. Dr. Chun, what's the real reason you're here? What's Agent Williams' actual mission? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Operation Deep Burn. If the infection cannot be contained through conventional means, Williams has authorization to sterilize the entire region using tactical nuclear devices. Nuclear devices in the middle of populated areas. The official cover story is already prepared accidental detonation of stored mining explosives. The entire operation will be classified for the next 50 years. Roberto turned back to face her. How long do we have? 18 hours. If the infected population reaches what Williams considers critical mass, or if the entities show signs of coordinating a mass emergence event, he'll implement the sterilization protocol. And how many people are we talking about? Chun consulted her tablet computer. Current infected count is at 23 individuals. Williams' threshold for sterilization is 50. 23. Roberto said slowly. Dr. Chun, what happens if someone refuses to cooperate with your study? What happens if they try to fight this infection on their own? Sheriff, I need you to understand something. The integration process, once begun, cannot be reversed through conventional medical intervention. The organisms have been adapting to human physiology for over 70 years of study. They've learned to resist every treatment we've developed. But there might be other ways. Older ways. Chun looked at him sharply. What do you mean? The Native American tribes that lived in this region for thousands of years, they had to have encountered these entities before, and they survived. Sheriff, we've investigated every historical account of anomalous disappearances in this region. There's no evidence of any successful resistance to the entities. Maybe you weren't looking in the right places. Roberto walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder he'd inherited from his predecessor. Inside were dozens of reports dating back to the 1800s missing persons cases, strange illnesses, unexplained phenomena in the desert. Dr. Chun, look at this pattern. Every 30 to 40 years there's a spike in disappearances around the same geographic locations. But then it stops, suddenly and completely. She studied the historical data with growing interest. You're right. There are clear cyclical patterns, but they break off abruptly rather than tapering gradually. Something was stopping them. Someone was fighting back successfully. Chun's scientific excitement was palpable. Sheriff, if there's even a possibility of a non-nuclear solution to this crisis, we need to investigate it immediately. Roberto was already reaching for his radio. Dr. Chun, I think it's time we had a conversation with some people who might remember the old stories. And I think we need to do it before Agent Williams realizes we're working against his timeline. Outside, The sun was setting behind the federal command post, and Roberto could see Agent Williams consulting his watch with the precision of a man counting down to an irreversible decision. 18 hours to find an alternative to nuclear sterilization. 18 hours to save his brother and his community from both an ancient alien intelligence and the cold calculations of government protocol. Doc Harrison's medical kit had never been intended for this kind of field work. Spread across Ruth's kitchen table, the familiar instruments of healing looked inadequate against the magnitude of what they faced. But over the past 6 hours he had transformed his standard emergency supplies into something that resembled a frontier scientist's survival kit. The morphine had been diluted with saline to extend the supply. Antibiotics were mixed with local honey, a traditional remedy his grandmother had sworn by based on Sophia's cryptic suggestion that the mothers feared the work of the busy ones. His stethoscope shared space with mineral samples Eli had collected from around the ranch, rocks that seemed to emit a faint luminescence in the darkness. "Sam, you sure about this mixture?" Ruth asked, watching him carefully measure out doses of the modified treatment. "I'm not sure about anything anymore, Ruth, but Sophia responded better to my improvised remedies than to conventional medicine. There's something about combining modern techniques with older knowledge that seems to slow the integration process." Eli sat by the window, his grotesquely swollen face turned toward the desert where the federal command post blazed with artificial light. The infection was advancing rapidly now, but he was still fighting it, still maintaining enough of his human consciousness to serve as their guide. "They're moving equipment," he reported. "Big trucks, containment units. Williams isn't planning to wait the full 18 hours. Ruth pressed her granddaughter closer to her side. Sophia's condition had stabilized somewhat after Doc's modified treatment, but the child's eyes still held that ancient knowledge that was both blessing and curse. "Abuela, the mothers are frightened. The loud men with their bright lights are disturbing the deep songs. If they get much closer to the first cave, all 17 sites will wake up at once." Sheriff Martinez burst through the back door. Dr. Chun closed behind him. Both looked haggard from their investigation into historical records and their growing understanding of the scope of the conspiracy. "We found something," Roberto announced. Chun was right about the cyclical pattern, but she was wrong about there being no successful resistance. Dr. Chun spread a collection of old photographs and documents across the table next to Doc's medical supplies. Sheriff Martinez located these in the County Historical Society. They're letters and reports from a Catholic missionary named Father Miguel Santos, who worked with the Apache tribes in this region from 1880 to 1910. Ruth examined one of the photographs. Stern-faced priest standing with a group of Native Americans in front of what looked like a sealed cave entrance. "Santos, that was my husband's great-grandfather's name. According to Father Santos' records, the Apache had detailed knowledge of what they called the dream stealers," Roberto continued. "Entities that lived in the deep places and could take control of human minds. But they also had a method for stopping them." Sophia looked up from her drawings with sudden interest. "The treaty songs, the ones I've been trying to remember." Dr. Chun consulted her notes. "Father Santos describes a ritual performed by Apache medicine men and women, using specific mineral compounds found in the region, combined with ceremonial practices designed to close the doors of dreaming." "Mineral compounds?" Doc Harrison examined the rocks Eli had collected. These samples all contained high concentrations of copper oxide and iron compounds, elements that are abundant in this desert. The Apache would grind specific rocks into powder, mix them with water from sacred springs, and use the mixture to create protective barriers around compromised cave sites, Roberto explained. According to Santos, the ritual would force the entities back into dormancy. Eli turned from the window, his swollen features twisting with effort as he fought to speak clearly. The springs. I remember now. There's a natural spring in the deepest chamber of the original cave. Tommy and I saw it, but we didn't understand its significance. Abuela, Sophia whispered. The mothers remember the treaty. They remember the singing stones and the water that burns. They're afraid of what happens when the treaty is restored. Ruth felt a chill of understanding. They're afraid because it worked before. The Apache found a way to force them back to sleep. Dr. Chun was making rapid calculations on her tablet. If we can reproduce the Apache ritual, we might be able to reverse the integration process and force a mass dormancy event across all 17 sites. Might, Doc Harrison emphasized. Dr. Chun, what happens to the infected individuals if we succeed? Can the integration process be reversed? I don't know. The historical records suggest that some affected individuals were returned to normal consciousness, but others remain partially integrated. The Apache considered them sacred, bridge keepers between the human and spirit worlds. Ruth looked at Sophia, seeing both her beloved granddaughter and something else, an ancient intelligence that was learning to coexist with human consciousness. And if we fail, Agent Williams implements nuclear sterilization, or all 17 sites wake up simultaneously, and we face a regional catastrophe involving thousands of infected individuals. Eli pushed himself upright with visible effort. Then we don't fail. Ruth, I need you to gather every able-bodied person you trust. We'll need help carrying supplies to the cave and protecting the ritual site while it's being performed. Eli, you can barely stand. How are you going to make a 20-mile trek through the desert? Because I have to. His voice carried the stubborn determination that had defined him throughout his life. This started with me and Tommy opening that cave. It ends with me helping to close it. Sophia stood up suddenly, her small face serious with purpose. Mr. Eli, you don't have to carry all the guilt. Uncle Tommy wrote in his letter that he convinced everyone to open the cave. You were just trying to help. The child walked to Doc Harrison's modified medical kit and carefully selected 3 mineral samples, holding them up to the light. These are the singing stones. The mothers fear them because they remember the old treaty, but they also respect them because the treaty protected both sides. Protected both sides? Ruth asked. The deep ones get to sleep in peace, and the surface people get to live without fear. But when the big burning came from the sky, when the treaty was forgotten, both sides suffered. Dr. Chum looked up from her historical documents. Sophia, do you know how to perform the ritual? Can the mothers teach you? The child closed her eyes, and for a moment her face took on the serene expression of someone listening to distant music. The ritual needs 4 elements. The singing stones ground to powder, water from the sacred spring, songs in the old language, and, she hesitated, and a bridge keeper who can speak to both sides. A bridge keeper, Doc Harrison repeated. Someone who's partially integrated, but still maintains human consciousness. Ruth felt her heart clench as she realized what Sophia was suggesting. No, absolutely not. You're 8 years old. Abuela, I'm the only one who can do it. Mr. Eli, and Uncle Tommy and the others, they're too far into the integration process. But I was infected through contact, not direct exposure. I can still choose which voice to listen to. Sheriff Martinez was already moving toward the door. I'll gather who I can trust. Deputy Collins, Frank Wheeler, if we can find him, maybe. Some of the ranchers who haven't been directly affected. Roberto, wait. Dr. Chun held up her tablet, showing satellite imagery of the federal command post. Agent Williams has moved up his timeline. I'm reading massive energy signatures from the containment units. He's preparing for sterilization within the next 6 hours. 6 hours, Eli said grimly. It'll take us 3 hours just to reach the cave site, assuming we can avoid the federal perimeter. Ruth made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Then we leave in 1 hour. Doc, can you have your modified treatments ready by then? Ruth, the risk. The risk is losing Sophia either way, Sam. At least this way, she has a chance to choose her own fate. Sophia approached her grandmother and took her weathered hands in her small ones. Abuela, I need you to understand something. Even if the ritual works, even if we restore the treaty, I won't be exactly the same afterward. What do you mean? The bridge keepers have to stay connected to both sides. I'll still be me, still be your Sophia, but I'll also carry part of the deep one's dreams. I'll know things, see things differently. Ruth pulled her granddaughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair while she still could. As long as you're still you inside, Mia. As long as you can still love and be loved. I can, Abuela. The mothers understand love. They've been watching human families for thousands of years, learning from us. That's part of why they chose children like me. We carry the strongest connections to love. Doc Harrison finished packing his modified medical kit, adding the mineral samples and containers for the sacred spring water. Ruth, there's something else we need to consider. If this ritual works, if we force a mass dormancy event, what happens to the federal research program? Dr. Chung looked up from destroying her tablet's data files. The program dies with the sterilization order, one way or another. If Williams implements nuclear containment, the sites become inaccessible for decades. If we succeed with the Apache ritual, there won't be any active specimens to study. Either way, the government loses 70 years of research, Roberto observed. Good, Ruth said fiercely. Some knowledge is too dangerous to be gathered. Outside, the desert wind was picking up, carrying the scent of distant rain and the sound of helicopters from the federal staging area. Through the window, they could see lights moving in the darkness, search teams expanding their perimeter, containment units being positioned at strategic locations. Eli struggled to his feet, his infected form casting strange shadows in the lamplight. Ruth, there's one more thing Sophia needs to know about the ritual. According to Tommy's memories, which I can access now through the collective, the bridge keeper doesn't just translate between human and entity consciousness. What else? She becomes the guardian of the treaty. For as long as she lives, she be responsible for maintaining the balance, for watching over the sealed places and making sure they stay sealed. Sophia nodded solemnly, her young face bearing an expression of acceptance that broke Ruth's heart. I understand, Mr. Eli. Uncle Tommy was trying to do that job, but he wasn't chosen properly, wasn't prepared. That's why the treaty started breaking down. Ruth gathered her family photograph from the mantel, tucking it securely in her jacket pocket. Then we make sure you're prepared, Mia. We make sure you have everything you need to succeed where others have failed. The clock on the wall showed they had less than 5 hours before Agent Williams' sterilization deadline. 5 hours to traverse 20 miles of desert, locate the sacred spring, perform a ritual described in 100-year-old mission records, and save both her granddaughter and her community from fates that defied imagination. As they prepared to leave the safety of her saloon for the unknown dangers of the desert, Ruth whispered a prayer to saints she'd stopped believing in years ago. She prayed for courage, for wisdom, and for the strength to let go of the little girl she'd raised and trust in the bridge keeper her granddaughter was becoming. The ancient chamber seal stood exactly as it had 10 years ago. Massive stones fitted together with a precision that spoke of desperate urgency and ancient knowledge. But now, in the harsh glare of their flashlights, Eli could see details that his younger self had missed, symbols carved into the rock faces, worn smooth by centuries, but still visible to those who knew how to look. The federal perimeter had been easier to bypass than expected. Agent Williams' teams were focused on the approaches they thought rational people would take, not the treacherous route through Devil's Canyon that Eli had remembered from his infected dreams. Sophia had guided them through passages that seemed impossible for a child to navigate, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone following an internal map. Now they stood before the sealed entrance, and Eli could feel the pull of the collective consciousness stronger than ever. Behind the ancient stones, something vast and patient was stirring in response to their presence. "The seal is exactly as Father Santos described," Dr. Chun whispered, consulting the mission records by flashlight. "Multiple stone barriers with symbols representing protection and binding." Doc Harrison was already preparing his modified treatments, laying out the mineral samples on a flat rock like surgical instruments. The copper and iron compounds seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, responding to some form of energy emanating from behind the seal. "Ruth, the spring should be about 50 meters inside the main chamber," Eli said, his voice strained with the effort of speaking clearly. "But once we open this seal, there's no guarantee we can control what comes out." Ruth held Sophia close, feeling the child's small body trembling with more than just cold. "Mia, are you ready for this?" Sophia nodded, her young face set with determination that reminded Ruth painfully of her late husband. "The mothers are scared, Abuela. They can feel the loud men getting closer with their burning machines. They'd rather sleep again than face what happened in Nevada." Sheriff Martinez and Deputy Collins had taken positions on either side of the cave entrance, their weapons drawn despite the futility of bullets against what they might face. Roberto's radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications from the federal command post. "Williams is moving faster than Chen predicted," he reported. "They're airlifting the nuclear device now. We have maybe 2 hours." Dr. Chun finished documenting the seal symbols with her camera. "According to Santos, the stones have to be removed in a specific sequence to avoid triggering a defensive response from the entities. Sophia, can the mothers guide us through the sequence?" Doc asked. The child approached the sealed entrance, placing her small hands against the central stone. The symbol seemed to pulse with increased brightness at her touch, and her eyes took on the distant quality that indicated communication with the collective. They remembered the last time this seal was opened by someone who knew the proper words. It was after the big burning in Nevada, when they felt their brothers and sisters screaming across the desert. Sophia's voice carried harmonics that made everyone present feel the weight of ancient sorrow. "The last time?" Eli struggled to focus through the increasing pressure in his skull. "Sophia, who opened the seal before us?" "Uncle Tommy's grandfather. He was one of the Apache who learned the treaty songs from his elders. When the Nevada site was destroyed, he came here to make sure these deep ones understood they had to sleep deeper, stay hidden longer." Ruth felt pieces of a larger picture clicking into place. "Tommy's family has been guarding this place for generations. But the knowledge was lost when Tommy's grandfather died without passing on the complete ritual. Tommy only remembered fragments, dreams, and warnings. That's why he was so desperate to open the cave 10 years ago. Part of him remembered his duty, but not the proper way to fulfill it." Sophia began moving stones in a pattern that seemed to follow no logic Eli could discern. But each stone she touched moved easily despite weighing hundreds of pounds. The symbols glowed brighter with each stone removed, and a warm breeze began flowing from the widening gap. "The chamber is pressurized," Doc observed. "There's definitely something active down there." As the final stone was moved aside, Sophia stepped back and looked at each of them with eyes that held centuries of accumulated wisdom. "Once we go inside, everything changes. The bridge between worlds opens, and I become responsible for keeping it stable." Ruth knelt beside her granddaughter, memorizing every detail of her face in case this was the last time she saw Sophia as simply a child. "Are you sure about this, Maya?" "Abuela, look." Sophia pulled out the family photograph that Ruth carried, pointing to the gap-toothed smile of her younger self. "I'm not losing who I am. I'm just becoming more than I was. The entrance to the chamber yawned before them like the throat of some primordial creature. Warm air flowing out carrying scents of earth and time and something else. Something that spoke of intelligence so ancient that human civilization was barely a footnote in its memory. Eli stepped forward first, his infected consciousness serving as an early warning system for dangers ahead. The collective is welcoming us, but they're also preparing defenses. If they perceive any threat to the nesting chambers, they'll release everything at once. Behind them, the desert sky was beginning to lighten with false dawn, and in the distance, the sound of helicopters grew louder. Agent Williams and his sterilization protocol were running out of patience, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, thousands of ancient entities waited to learn whether they would be allowed to return to their patient sleep or forced to wake up hungry after millions of years of dreams. Eli's cowboy hat lay abandoned at the chamber entrance, a final symbol of the man he had been before accepting his role as guardian of the ancient covenant. Inside the vast cavern, bioluminescent organisms painted the walls in shades of blue and green that had no names in human language, and the air thrummed with the collective heartbeat of entities older than complex life on Earth. The chamber was even more magnificent and terrible than Eli's infected memories had suggested. Cocoon-like structures hung from the ceiling in perfect geometric patterns, and the missing townspeople, Martha, Jake, Pete, and the others, floated within them in what appeared to be suspended animation. Their faces were peaceful, almost beatific, but clearly no longer entirely human. "My God," Doc Harrison whispered, his medical training warring with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "They're alive, but they're being transformed," Sophia finished, her young voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the process intimately. "The mothers don't kill, Dr. Sam. They adopt. But sometimes adoption changes both the children and the parents." Ruth tried to process what she was seeing while maintaining her grip on sanity. The chamber stretched beyond the range of their flashlights, and she could hear movement in the darkness, rustling, shifting sounds that suggested the presence of far more entities than they had imagined. "Sophia, can you communicate with them? Can you ask them to release the townspeople?" The child approached one of the cocoons, reaching up to touch its translucent surface. Inside, Pete Rawlings opened his eyes, but they were no longer entirely his own. When he smiled at Sophia, his expression held the same ancient wisdom they had seen in her face. "Uncle Pete understands now, boy. The mothers didn't take him, he chose to stay. The integration is complete, and he's happy." Sheriff Martinez stepped closer to his radio, trying to maintain contact with the outside world despite the cave's interference. "Chun, Williams is demanding status updates. How much longer do we need?" Dr. Chun was documenting everything with her camera, knowing that this might be the only record of what transpired in the chamber. The ritual site should be deeper in the cave system, near the sacred spring Santis mentioned. Eli moved toward the center of the chamber with the slow, deliberate steps of someone fighting against overwhelming internal pressure. His transformation was accelerating, but he was still maintaining enough human consciousness to serve as their guide. "The spring is there," he said, pointing toward a passage that led deeper into the earth. "But Sophia needs to understand something. First, once she becomes the permanent bridge keeper, she can never leave this place. The connection has to be maintained continuously." Ruth felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "Never leave?" "Not never, abuela," Sophia said gently, "but I'll live differently. I'll have responsibilities that keep me connected to the deep places. I'll grow up, but I'll grow up as something new." Doc Harrison had been studying the suspended townspeople with professional fascination. "Ruth, I need to tell you something. The integration process isn't necessarily permanent for everyone. If Sophia can establish proper control as bridgekeeper, some of these people might be able to return to surface life. Some? Those who were infected recently, through secondary contact. But the original exposure victims, Eli, Tommy, the others from the cattle drive, they're too far integrated to separate safely. Eli nodded, his swollen features twisting into something that might have been acceptance. I understand, Doc. This is where I belong now. Where I should have been 10 years ago if we'd understood what we were dealing with. Sophia walked to the center of the chamber, where the bioluminescent patterns seemed to converge. She began humming softly, and the ancient symbols carved into the walls responded by glowing brighter. The humming evolved into something that wasn't quite singing, wasn't quite speech, a form of communication that bridged the gap between human language and the collective consciousness of the entities. She's calling them, Ruth realized. All of them, from all 17 sites. Dr. Chun looked up from her equipment in alarm. If all 17 colonies respond simultaneously, they have to, Sophia explained without breaking her rhythmic communication. The treaty has to include everyone, or it won't hold. The mothers are afraid that if some sites are left out, those entities will become desperate and dangerous. Above them, the sound of helicopters grew louder, and Sheriff Martinez's radio crackled with increasing urgency. Agent Williams had reached his breaking point and was preparing to implement the nuclear option whether they succeeded or not. But in the chamber, something extraordinary was happening. The collective consciousness that had terrified them was revealing itself to be something more complex, not malevolent, but desperately lonely. The entities had been isolated for so long that the brief contact with human minds through the infection process had reminded them of what they had lost. Eli felt his human consciousness beginning to merge completely with the collective, but instead of horror, he experienced a sense of homecoming. His memories, his love for Sarah, his decades of life on the ranch, all of it was being welcomed and preserved within something vast and ancient and ultimately compassionate. Sophia, he said, his voice becoming harmonized with otherworldly resonances, tell Ruth goodbye for me, and tell her I finally understand what I was meant to do with my life. The transformation was complete, but Eli Cutter, guardian, protector, bridge between worlds, had never been more himself. The memorial stone stood simple and weathered against the desert sunrise, carved from local red sandstone with words that told only part of the truth. Eli Cutter, 1980 to 2025, Guardian. 6 months after the crisis that had nearly consumed Copper Ridge, Ruth still came here every morning to leave fresh water and speak to the silence about things that mattered. The official story had been surprisingly close to reality, with a few crucial omissions. A biological hazard had been contained through the heroic efforts of local residents and federal agencies working together. Several missing persons had been recovered and were undergoing extended medical treatment. The cave systems in question had been permanently sealed for public safety. What the official reports didn't mention was that the permanent sealing had been accomplished not with government explosives, but with the restoration of a treaty older than recorded history. They didn't mention that the biological hazard had been negotiated back into dormancy rather than destroyed. And they certainly didn't mention that the real hero of the crisis was an 8-year-old girl who now lived between worlds. Ruth's granddaughter emerged from the rocky outcropping where the original cave had been sealed, moving with the quiet grace that had replaced her childhood exuberance. Sophia looked older now, not physically but in the depths of her eyes, which held knowledge that would have crushed an adult mind, but seemed to rest easily on her young shoulders. Good morning, Abuela. The deep ones send their thanks for the water. Offerings. How are they today, Mia? Content. The singing stones keep them in peaceful sleep, and the treaty dreams are strong. Mr. Eli says to tell you the prince is doing well in the lower pastures. Ruth smiled at the familiar message. Eli's consciousness, preserved within the collective, maintained his concern for the horses and the ranch that Doc Harrison now managed in trust for the community. Some aspects of personality Ruth had learned transcended even transformation into something posthuman. And the others? Uncle Tommy is teaching the young ones about surface customs. He's gotten very good at explaining baseball to entities that experience time differently than we do. Sophia's grin was pure 8-year-old mischief, a reminder that transformation didn't erase the essential self. The town of Copper Ridge had adapted to its new reality with the writhing resilience that desert communities developed out of necessity. Doc. Harrison continued his practice, though his methods now incorporated treatments that would have baffled medical schools. Sheriff Martinez, now simply Roberto, since federal oversight had made his official position redundant, served as liaison between the surface community and their unusual new neighbors. Most of the infected townspeople had been successfully returned to normal life, their brief integration with the collective leaving them with expanded empathy and occasional prophetic dreams, but otherwise unchanged. A few, like Martha Hendricks, had chosen to remain partially integrated, serving as secondary bridgekeepers who could communicate between Sophia and the wider community. Dr. Chun called yesterday, Ruth mentioned as they walked back toward town. The program has been officially discontinued, and the research sites are being converted to ecological preserves. She visits the deep ones sometimes through the treaty dreams. They're teaching her about biological systems that operate on geological timescales. She says it's revolutionizing her understanding of planetary ecology. Dr. Sarah Chun had become an unexpected ally, using her influence within the Findatus scientific community to ensure that the Copper Ridge solution was applied to similar situations elsewhere. The government's appetite for weaponizing ancient organisms had diminished considerably after learning that the entities could coordinate defensive responses across continental distances. The $1 saloon was already busy when Ruth and Sophia arrived for the morning shift. The federal presence had ended months ago, but their departure had been replaced by a different kind of visitor researchers, anthropologists and spiritual seekers who had somehow learned that something significant had happened in this small desert town. Ruth had mixed feelings about the attention. The additional business was welcome, but she worried about protecting Sophia's privacy and the delicate balance they had achieved with their unusual neighbors. Abuela, don't worry so much. The treaty protects us from people who would cause harm, and the curious ones usually go away once they realize there's nothing dramatic to see. Nothing dramatic, Ruth repeated, looking at her granddaughter, who could speak to alien intelligences and prevent nuclear disasters before lunch. I suppose it's all relative. Jake Martinez, Roberto's nephew, and one of the few original cattle drive survivors who had chosen to remain on the surface, waved from his table in the corner where he was teaching a group of university students about desert ecology. His partial integration had left him with an intuitive understanding of complex biological systems that made him an excellent guide and educator. The important thing, Sophia said, settling into her favorite booth with a coloring book, is that everyone gets to choose. The mothers learned that from us, the value of individual choice within collective harmony. Ruth watched her granddaughter color pictures of horses and cowboys, occasionally pausing to listen to voices only she could hear. The child was growing up exactly as she should, just with responsibilities that stretched across species and epochs. Through the window, the desert stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, and Ruth could imagine the vast network of interconnected caves where ancient intelligences dreamed peacefully under Sophia's guardianship. The landscape looked the same as it always had, but Ruth knew she was seeing it with different eyes, now not as empty wilderness, but as the surface layer of a complex ecosystem that included forms of life beyond human imagination. The memorial stone outside town would weather and fade over the decades, but the treaty it represented would endure as long as there were bridgekeepers to maintain the balance. Sophia would grow up, train successors, and eventually join the collective herself. when her time came. But that was far in the future, and for now, she was simply Ruth's granddaughter, humming old Spanish lullabies while she colored and keeping one ear open for the deep songs that kept the world safe.